Understanding your stats and armor is crucial for every Destiny player. It's a key component of any build that you make. However, it's often extremely confusing for a new player to wrap their head around this concept. So today, I hope to give you the foundational knowledge so that you understand what your stats do and how to improve them in order to conquer any PvE activity. A disclaimer: Destiny 2 is a game that constantly changes and evolves. Therefore, some information in this video may become less accurate the later you watch this. Although I hope the information will be true even after the launch of the final shape, there are no guarantees that Bungie will not change anything. The armor farming section of this video in particular may become inaccurate when the final shape launches, but I will release an updated version of it in the future. Without further ado, let's get into it. To understand why we need to farm for high stat armor, it's important that you have an understanding of what your stats are. All Guardians have 6 stats that are displayed here. These stats are mobility, resilience, recovery, discipline, intellect, and strength. For each stat, you may reach a maximum of 100 points. You can go over 100, but it won't confer any benefits. These stats are broken up through a series of checkpoints called tiers. These tiers are 10 points each, which means each stat can go from tier 0 to tier 10. But how do these stats influence your Guardian and your builds? Let's go through each of these stats one by one and find out what effects they have. Mobility affects your movement speed. It affects how fast you walk as well as your jump height. Keep in mind, mobility only affects your walking speed and not your sprint speed. Mobility is also the class stat for hunters. I know that class stat may be confusing or new to newer players, but it just means that a class stat, aside from their main effect, also governs the cooldown of your class ability. For hunters, the higher your mobility, the lower the cooldown of your dodge. Resilience in PvE affects how much damage resistance you have. The higher your resilience, the more damage resistance you have, up to a maximum of 30% damage resistance. It also impacts the amount of shields that your character has. Resilience is also the class stat of Titans, and it also affects the cooldown of your barricades. Recovery affects both recovery delay and recovery rate. Recovery delay governs how long you have to wait before your health and shields begin regenerating. Recovery rate affects how fast your HP and shields regenerate. Recovery is also the class stat for Warlocks as it affects the cooldown of your rifts. Discipline affects the cooldown of your grenades. Higher discipline gives you faster grenade cooldown. Do keep in mind that discipline only affects grenade cooldown and not grenade blast radius or damage in any way. Intellect affects the passive recharge rate for your super. Higher intellect means that your super will passively build up charge faster. Again, it will not affect super damage or anything else in any way, with the exception of the passive recharge rate of your super. The final stat, Strength, affects the cooldown of your powered melee ability. Similarly to Discipline and Intellect, this will not affect your melee damage or lunge range, just simply the cooldown of your powered melee ability. Now that we understand what each stat does and how it affects our Guardians, let's talk about stat priority. This is important as you cannot have every stat be maxed out or even close to maxed out. You will need to decide which stats that you want to focus on. A typical build will have 2 or 3 stats at 100 points, with the other stats being much lower. Because of that, you will need to figure out where to focus the majority of your stats into. For PvE, the first stat that all 3 classes would want to focus into is Resilience. 30% damage resistance is nothing to scoff at, and will give you the survivability that you need to tackle endgame content. The next stat that we should focus on should be either Discipline or Strength. Since most builds in Destiny 2 utilizes either the grenade or the powered melee, having lowered cooldowns will help us keep a high uptime on our builds. In general, Discipline is better as most builds will focus on the grenades and less on the melee. And even the melee focused builds such as Sunbreaker Titan with Throwing Hammer and Assassin's Cowl Arcstrider Hunter have ways to get their melee back without waiting for the cooldown. However, builds that do not rely on their grenades as much, such as Banner of War Berserker Titan, or have ways to get their grenades back very quickly, such as Sunbrazer's Dawnblade Warlock, you may consider focusing into Strength to reduce the cooldown of your melee ability, but in general, Discipline is more applicable, and whether you use Discipline or Strength in some builds vary from player to player based on playstyle, even amongst the endgame player. The final stat we should focus on is either Recovery or Mobility. Mobility only applies to Hunters specifically. In endgame PvE, survivability is king, and therefore we want to make sure that we focus on that. Having recovery means that your health and shields will regenerate faster, and begin regenerating sooner. Therefore, for Titans and Warlocks, there really isn't any other stat that is worth investing in, so any excess stats after reaching 100 Resilience and Discipline should be focused on recovery. Warlocks also have the added benefit of recovery lowering their rift cooldowns. For hunters, recovery is a very good option as well, since builds such as Assassin's Cowl Arcstrider or gunslingers in general have ways of getting their dodge back quicker. However, for Night Stalker hunters, mobility isn't a bad stat to focus instead of recovery, as you can use Orbs of Power to quickly heal up due to Devour. I will quickly go over one stat I have not mentioned yet, which is Intellect. Due to the state of the current sandbox and the fact that using and generating Orbs of Power has become the focal point of many builds, super energy gets generated very quickly. Combine that with mods such as Ashes to Assets and Hands On, and you will quickly realize that Intellect does not noticeably impact how fast supers come back online. As a result, Intellect is currently extremely weak in PvE, and therefore you generally never invest any stats into it. Now that we understand our stats and which one we should invest in, how do we get the points to invest into those stats in the first place? Well, stat points will come from your armor, as well as potential bonuses from subclass fragments and armor mods. However, the main source of stats will still be from your armor. So how do we get the armor with the stats that we need? This is where armor farming comes into play. Every piece of armor that drops will roll with a different amount of points in each stat and a different stat total. It is your job as a player to determine which armor is good enough to keep and which armor to use in your builds. To start learning the process of armor farming, let me first explain to you the bucket system, which is the way that the game determines stat rolls on high stat armor. The method that armor stat rolls are generated has been partially figured out by the community. This is called the bucket system. These buckets are basically groups of stats. The top bucket consists of mobility, resilience, and recovery. The bottom bucket consists of discipline, intellect, and strength. Each piece of high stat armor will have a spike of stats in a bucket and another spike in another bucket. If there is a third spike, it will be in the first bucket. Why do we need to understand these buckets? Well, if we know that an armor piece will have two spikes in two different buckets, we can try to manipulate it to our favor. So how do we manipulate these randomly rolled armor stats? We use ghost mods. If you inspect your ghost, you will find that you can install mods on it. On the third column, you will see the armorer class of mods. These mods will allow you to guarantee at least 10 points in one stat. So the question is, which ghost mod do we want to use? The easy answer is to use discipline armor or strength armor. But why do we want to use these mods? Well, if we can guarantee a spike in either discipline or strength, there will be a higher chance that we will get 2 spikes in the top bucket. And since in most classes we will want to prioritize both resilience and recovery, this will allow us to try to get 100 resilience, 100 discipline, and as much recovery as we can. So therefore, using discipline or strength armor when farming your armor is the best option. Now that we know how to try to manipulate the armor stat rolls, let's talk about where to farm high stat armor. High stat armor is defined as armor with a total stat roll of 60 or above. I will detail some sources for you, as well as mentioning which DLC is needed for each farming method. Let's talk about free-to-play methods first. You have a few options: Legend Dares of Eternity, the Solstice event, Iron Banner, Vault of Glass, King's Fall, and Crota's End are all good sources of high stat armor. Just make sure to have the correct armorer mod before launching the event to increase the chances of getting armor with the stats that you need. For owners of DLC, your options are much more open. Firstly, Pit of Heresy's final boss will typically drop good high stat armor, which makes it a common spot to farm should the dungeon be featured that week. You will need the Shadowkeep DLC to access this dungeon. The easiest method for DLC owners currently would be to focus armor from seasonal vendors. As of this video's release, we are currently in the Season of the Wish, with a final shape delay being confirmed. With that being the case, you have more time to use the seasonal vendors to focus high stat armor. These vendors are located in the Helm and will require you to have purchased the season that they are associated with. This will be Season 20, Season of Defiance, for the War Table, Season 21, Season of the Deep, for the Sonar Station, Season 22, Season of the Witch, for the Ritual Table, and Season 23, Season of the Wish, for the Riven Spirit. If you own the Lightfall Annual Pass or are planning to purchase it before the release of the final shape, you'll have access to all these vendors until the release of the final shape on June 4th. The final source of high stat armor, and the one that probably gives you the best reward, is farming Master Dungeons. This includes Grasp of Avarice from the 30th Anniversary DLC, Duality and Spire of the Watcher from the Witch Queen Dungeon Key, as well as Ghosts of the Deep and Warlord's Ruin from the Lightfall Dungeon Key. These Master Dungeons will reward you with Artifice Armor. This armor will not only be high stat, but it will come with an additional mod slot that allows you to put an extra 3 points in any stat that you would like. This is the premium choice of armor for endgame and will be necessary if you would like to fully optimize your build. Keep in mind that this is not necessary for doing raids, dungeons, grandmasters, or any content really. It's just an option for the players who would like to go above and beyond to ensure they get as many stat points as possible. Before we end this video, let's talk about judging armor rolls and choosing armor for your builds. Ideally, we want armor with spikes in the stats that we want. On the screen, I've shown an example of a good armor roll versus a bad armor roll. On the left, you can see we have big spikes of points in the stats that we want, versus the armor on the right, where it's a more even spread. We want this spiky armor on the left as it reduces the points invested in the stats that we do not want in the first place. So when you are judging your armor rolls, we want to make sure that it has good spikes in the stats that we want. The armor stat total should also be a factor. A general rule of thumb that I follow is that an armor piece has to have 63 or higher stat totals in order for me to consider it. The only time where this rule will be waived is that if the stat distribution is really good. As for choosing which armor to use for your builds, you should use a resource like D2 Armor Picker. I have a video on D2 Armor Picker that you may want to watch after this video. The link will be in the top right corner of your screen. That should cover the basics of understanding your stats and armor farming. If you would like more information on how stats affect your builds, I will link the D2 Compendium in the description below. This resource will allow you to check the specific value of perks, armor, stats, and more. If you found this video useful, please consider subscribing to this channel and enabling notifications. Guides will be posted on Mondays and Thursdays. Thank you for watching and happy farming!